Some people learn their lessons the hard way, and some people don't live long enough to learn them at all. Picture this, a bar, a Friday night. A drunk guy named Tyler who thought he was the toughest man in the room. He walks up to a quiet stranger sitting alone in the corner, minding his own business, nursing a glass of water, and slaps him right across the face, just for laughs, just to show off in front of his friends. The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He didn't even blink. And that's when Tyler noticed something. The stranger's hands, scarred, weathered, hands that had clearly seen things Tyler's had never even dreamed of. And the look in the man's eyes, it wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something worse. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from someone who knows, without any doubt, that he could end this situation in under 3 seconds, and was choosing not to. Tyler had just slapped a man who had killed 47 people and never lost a single fight in his entire life. And by the time Tyler figured that out, it was almost too late. This is the story of James, the Ghost Merritt, a man whose name you've probably never heard, but whose story will make you rethink everything you think you know about strength, discipline, and what it really means to be dangerous. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand who James became, you have to understand where James came from. James Merritt was born in 1951 in a small, rundown town in rural Kentucky. His father was a coal miner. His mother cleaned houses. They didn't have much. What they had was a 2-bedroom house with a leaking roof, a second-hand truck that broke down twice a month, and a family that stuck together no matter what. James was the middle child of 5, and from a very young age, it was clear he was different. Not loud different, not look at me different. He was quiet different, still different. The kind of kid who would sit by himself and just watch things, watch people. He could spend hours just observing how someone moved, how they talked, what they did when they thought nobody was looking. His father noticed this, and instead of dragging him to Little League like every other dad in town, his father took him to see a man named Colonel Roy Dawson. Colonel Roy Dawson was 68 years old at the time, a veteran of 2 wars, a man who had served in Korea and Vietnam, who had trained soldiers, who had seen combat up close and personal in ways most people can't even imagine. He had retired to a farm just outside of town, and the only thing he asked of life now was to be left alone. But he made an exception for James. Nobody really knows exactly what was said in that first meeting. James would later describe it in an interview as the most important conversation of my life. But what came out of it was a commitment. Colonel Dawson agreed to train James, and James agreed to give everything he had. Here's what that training looked like. Every morning, James woke up at 4:30 a.m. He ran 5 miles before the sun came up. Then he spent 2 hours with Colonel Dawson, who taught him a combination of things: military hand-to-hand combat, wrestling techniques, and a kind of mental training that most people in the 1960s had never even heard of. Breathing exercises, meditation, controlled stillness. Colonel Dawson had one rule above all others. The most dangerous man in the room, he told James, is never the loudest one. James was 13 years old when he heard that for the first time. He never forgot it. By the time James was 16, he was physically unrecognizable from the skinny kid who had first walked onto Colonel Dawson's farm. Not because he was massive. He was never a huge guy. He stood about 5'11", around 190 pounds, but every single pound of him was conditioned. Every movement was deliberate. Every step he took looked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. And then the world did what it always does to young men from small towns in the early 1970s. It called them to war. James Merritt was drafted into the United States Army. In 1971, at the age of 19, he was sent to Vietnam. Now here's where this story takes a turn that most people can't really process unless they've been there. And I'm not going to pretend I fully understand what James went through, because I wasn't there. And neither were you. But I'm going to tell you what the records show, what the people who served alongside him said, and what James himself described in the handful of interviews he gave later in his life. James was placed in a special operations unit, the kind of unit whose missions didn't make it into the newspapers, the kind of unit that went into places that weren't on any official map and did things that the government would deny for decades afterward. He was, by every account from the men who served with him, an extraordinary soldier, not because he was reckless. Actually, it was the opposite. His commanding officer, a man named Captain David Holt, wrote in his service report, "Private Merritt demonstrates a level of tactical composure I have not seen in 15 years of service. Under fire, he becomes more calm, not less. More calm under fire. Think about that for a second. Most people, when things get scary, panic. Heart rate spikes. Breathing goes crazy. Tunnel vision sets in. The brain basically shuts down anything that isn't survival. James Merritt went the other direction. The more dangerous the situation, the more focused he became. Colonel Dawson's training had done something to his nervous system that most people spend their entire lives trying to achieve and never get close to. He served 3 tours in Vietnam. 3. When most soldiers were counting down the days to go home, James kept volunteering to go back. Why? He would answer that question in an interview in 2003, and his answer was something that stayed with me. He said, "I went back because I was the only one in my unit who could do what needed to be done without losing themselves doing it. Other men would come back from those missions and fall apart. I didn't fall apart. And if I wasn't there, someone else would have to do it, and they might not survive. So I went back." That's not a soldier who loved war. That's a soldier who understood what he was, accepted it, and used it to protect the men around him. Over the course of his 3 tours, James was involved in 47 confirmed kills. In the world of military service, that number places him in a category that very, very few soldiers ever reach. It's not something to celebrate in a simple way. These were real people, in a brutal war, in circumstances that no one should ever have to face. But it is a number that tells you exactly what kind of soldier James Merritt was. He returned home in 1975. And here's where the story gets complicated. Because coming home was, in many ways, harder than anything he'd faced in combat. The Vietnam era was rough for veterans. There were no big parades, no thank you for your service at airports. In many parts of the country, veterans were treated with suspicion or outright hostility. James came home to a country that didn't really know what to do with the men it had sent to fight a war it was embarrassed about. He moved back to Kentucky, took a job working construction, kept to himself. He didn't talk about what he'd done. He didn't tell war stories at bars. He didn't wear his medals or bring up his service. As far as anyone in his daily life was concerned, James Merritt was just a quiet guy who worked hard, paid his bills, and left you alone if you left him alone, which is exactly the situation he was in on that Friday night in 1979, when Tyler walked into the bar. Tyler was 24. He was what you'd call a local tough guy, the kind of guy who had won a few bar fights in his life and had convinced himself that made him dangerous. He came in with 3 of his friends. They'd been drinking since noon, and he was feeling like the most untouchable man alive. James was sitting in the corner alone. He was 27 at the time. He'd had a long day at the job site. He just wanted a quiet drink before going home. Tyler walked over, said something stupid. James didn't respond. Tyler said something else. James looked at him once, just one look, and then looked back at his drink. That probably should have been the end of it. But Tyler had an audience, and men who need an audience to feel powerful don't know how to walk away. He slapped James across the face. The bar went silent. And James, slowly, deliberately, set his glass down. He turned to look at Tyler fully for the first time. And he said, in a voice that was completely flat, completely steady, "You should go home." That's it. Not a threat, not a boast, just a statement. Tyler laughed. His friends laughed. He said something along the lines of, "What are you going to do about it, old man?" James stood up. He was not a scary-looking man. That was always the thing people said afterward. He didn't look like a movie action hero. He looked like a construction worker who needed a haircut. Average build, quiet face, calm eyes. But when he stood up, something changed in the room. Bartenders who were there said it later. Something just shifted. Like the air got heavier. Like everyone in the room instinctively understood that something was different about this man without knowing why. Tyler took a swing at James. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Tyler ended up on the floor. Not with a broken jaw, not hospitalized. Not in the condition you might expect given everything I've told you about James, just on the floor, controlled, precise. James had taken him down in a way that was almost gentle by combat standards. He could have done far, far worse. He chose not to. He looked at Tyler on the ground and said, "Stay down." Then he put money on the bar for his drink, picked up his jacket, and walked out. The bartender, a man named Gary Ellison, would later tell this story to a journalist doing a piece on Vietnam veterans in 1998. Gary said, "I've seen a lot of fights in my life. That wasn't a fight. A fight is 2 people trying to hurt each other. What I saw that night was one man making a decision, and another man learning from it." That story reached a retired Army journalist who tracked James down. And for the first time, James Merritt agreed to talk, at least a little. What came out of those conversations painted a picture that most people weren't ready for. Here was a man who had been one of the most effective combat soldiers of the Vietnam era, who had trained under one of the most experienced military tacticians the country had ever produced, who carried in his body and his mind a level of lethal capability that most people only see in movies, and those movies always get it wrong. And he was working construction, driving a second-hand truck, going home to a house he'd saved up for, with a dog named Sam and a vegetable garden out back. He didn't drink much. He didn't get into trouble. He didn't walk around with a chip on his shoulder. He had never, not once after returning from Vietnam, started a confrontation. He had been in exactly 3 physical altercations since coming home, and every single one of them was because someone else threw the first punch. When the journalist asked him how he managed to keep all that training, all that capability, all that experience, and just live a normal, quiet life, James was quiet for a long time. Then he said this: "Colonel Dawson told me something when I was a kid that I didn't fully understand until I came back from my second tour. He said, strength is not about what you can do. It's about what you choose not to do. Anyone can destroy something. It takes real discipline to protect something. Once I understood that, really understood it, everything got simpler." That line knocked me sideways the first time I read it. Think about how many people you know who mistake the ability to hurt someone for actual strength. Guys who talk the loudest in the room. Guys who need to prove something with their fists or their words or their status. Tyler was one of those guys. He thought power meant being able to push people around. James Merritt knew that real power is control. The control to choose, to decide, to walk away or not walk away because you're deciding, not because you're scared. He was never scared. That was the thing. He just didn't need to prove it. In the years that followed, James became something of a quiet legend in veteran circles. Word spread about who he was and what he'd done, not through anything he said himself, but through the men who had served alongside him, men who came forward as they got older. As Vietnam veterans began to get some of the recognition they'd been denied for decades, he was approached 3 times by government agencies who wanted to use his skills in various capacities. He declined every time. He took one job in his later years that felt right to him. He trained young soldiers at a regional base for about 6 years, teaching them the same things Colonel Dawson had once taught him. Mental stillness, breathing under pressure, the difference between reaction and response. He retired from that in 2001. He was 49 years old. He went back to Kentucky. He passed away in 2019 at the age of 67. He died in his bed, in his house, with his second dog, another one named Sam, sleeping at his feet. At his funeral, there were 11 people, his family, a few neighbors, and 4 old men who had flown in from different parts of the country. Nobody knew who they were until later. They were the only 4 surviving members of his Special Operations Unit from Vietnam. One of them, a man named Ed Corrigan, gave a short speech. He said only this: "James Merritt was the safest man I ever stood next to, and the most dangerous." I never understood how those 2 things fit together in one person until I got old enough to realize that's what honor actually looks like. Tyler, the man who slapped him in that bar, found out who James was a few weeks after the incident. A mutual friend told him. He drove to James's house, knocked on the door. When James answered, Tyler could barely get the words out. He said, "I heard what you are, what you've done. I just need to know. Why didn't you hurt me?" James looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Because you weren't a threat. You were just a scared kid making noise. Hurting you wouldn't have meant anything. Letting you walk away meant something." Tyler stood on that porch and cried like he hadn't cried since he was a child. He later got sober, moved to a different town, started a family. He said in an interview, years later, that moment on the porch was the one that changed his life. Not the bar, not getting knocked down, the porch. The fact that a man who could have destroyed him chose not to, and told him why. Strength that doesn't have to prove itself. Danger that chooses peace. Power that shows itself most clearly in what it holds back. James Merritt spent most of his life being the quietest man in every room he walked into, and he was without question the most capable. There are people in this world who are built differently, who have gone through things that change them at a level most of us will never touch. And the remarkable thing isn't that they survived it. It's what they chose to do with who they became on the other side. Tyler slapped a stranger for fun, and instead of losing his life, he found it. That stranger gave him something, not a lesson in fear, but a lesson in what it actually looks like when a man truly knows who he is.